There are so many obstacles that can block the path to a successful software project. When you come across one, it helps to think like a seasoned hiker and follow the trails marked by blue blazes, going around the problem so that you can get back on course and keep moving forward. Welcome to the Blue Blazes podcast. I'm your host for the journey, Jay Tower, and I'm a partner and principal consultant at Trailhead Technology Partners. In this series, we talk with industry experts who share their best tips for avoiding the pitfalls on the path to successful software projects. In this episode, I speak with Brian McKeiver. Brian is co-owner at BizStream. He's a solution architect, Microsoft MVP, both a Kentico Experience and Kontent MVP, and he has a couple of decades of experience leading his team of over 30 at BizStream, where they have about 100 clients around the country. He is also active in the tech community via his blog at mckeev.com. That's MCEEV.com. Today, Brian and I are talking about EOS, the Entrepreneurial Operating System. Let's get started. Hey, Brian, thanks for joining me today. Welcome to the podcast and blog.
Thanks,
we're going to talk
appreciate
about
it.
Yeah, love having you here. We're going to talk about EOS today, and the theme of this podcast is talking about software is a hard thing to do. A lot of software projects fail, come in late, don't meet the requirements, etc. And we're talking about things on this podcast that help us improve that success rate. And so EOS is one of the things that I know has affected both my company and your company. And so kind of wanted to talk about that with you. So if you don't mind, maybe first we could just talk about what EOS stands for first and maybe give me the elevator pitch for what it is.
So wait, Jay, you're saying that not every single project you've ever been a part of has successfully launched on time and under budget? Not every single one?
All of mine have, obviously.
Okay, well, great. Fantastic.
You're
doing better than me. So great question. What is EOS? And this is something that we've explained often. So it stands for the Entrepreneurial Operating System. And what it really is this 3 or 4 part or even 6 part system that shows entrepreneurs how to just organize a business. And I like to say the short way is to bring order to the chaos. It's not rocket science. It's not something that's like going to take you years and years to master. In fact, there's a really easy book about, what the heck is EOS? I really recommend people to check out if they're just interested in it. But it's basically a way to bring vision and traction into your organization and have a strong, healthy work-life balance, healthy relationships between you and your employees. And it's just kind of a common sense way to organize your business to basically do better and reduce stress. I mean, that's what it really boils down to for me.
Yeah. I think in that book called Traction, that kind of introduces concepts of EOS. I think it talks about arrows, like everybody in the organization has an arrow pointing in different directions and how inefficient that can be. And if you get all the arrows pointing together, then you get more of that traction, right?
Yep.
So right in the name, we've got OS for operating system, which sounds very techy, right? So this is perfect for our tech audience, but is that necessary? Like, is this just for tech companies?
No, not at all. In fact, I don't even think it started anywhere near tech companies. I think the OS, our technical backgrounds, we just jump to, wait, are we talking Linux or Windows or whatever? No, it has nothing to do with that. It really, any company can use this approach and strategy. And it's really just, if you take out of that, like, it's a system. That's the way to think of it. It's just a system and organizational structure.
Yeah. And entrepreneurial is the E, or entrepreneurs, operating system. So it's, is it just for startups, or, does this work well for different size companies?
So that's a great question. I think, when it comes to the size of the company that EOS best works for, they do have a target, and it's kind of not necessarily pure startup. It's more some organization who is a little bit over a certain revenue number and over a certain number of employees. I think if you had 2 employees, this isn't going to make a ton of sense. But I think the best practice to say is, over a dozen employees, I want to say, up into high numbers. And I challenge that a little bit, even though traditionally that's the way they explain it. I have a good friend. He runs an agency. He's small. He only has like 6 employees. And he was having some of these same challenges with working a crazy amount of hours, not allowing his staff to do their things without micromanagement. And he's having some problems and stress. And I said, I know you're only 6 or 7 person company, but check out EOS because it could help. The concepts can still be applied if you want to. Um, so yeah, basically there's definitely a number. It's around 12 to plus more, but maybe not great for just 2 people.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess if you have 2 people, then if you're just meeting with that other person once a day, once a week, whatever, right? Like that's where all your communication, the entire company is essentially communicating at that point, right?
Right.
Or if you're a one-person company, all of that happens in your brain, right?
Yep.
So, okay, so EOS doesn't have anything specifically to do with tech companies or software companies, even though there's that OS part of the acronym. So, in fact, it doesn't really have anything to say about how you run your software projects specifically. It's more about how you run your company. So,
Mhm.
since this podcast is about making software projects more successful, how have you guys at BizStream found that EOS running the company that way has impacted how successful you're able to deliver on your projects?
Yeah, it's been game changing for us at BizStream. I have a business partner. His name is Mark Schmidt. Him and I have been together for over 20 years doing this, and we've grown the size of the company to a little bit over 30, maybe 35 at this point. And for a long time, we just tried to do it our way without any classical business training. We are technical in our backgrounds. And the challenge that brings for running software projects is, where is there a clear line of communication on who's doing what? Who's accountable for what things? Who's responsible for what things? Why are certain things getting done? Why are they not? Who's testing? Oh, well, I'm writing code. I'm not testing. Who's going to do
Mm-hmm.
that? And sure, we came up with ways to kind of somewhat solve those problems. And we made it work for many years in just our own homegrown systems. But to really scale and to grow and not have everything be reliant on just the 2 leaders in the organization, that's where EOS really changed our world, frankly. And it did, like I said before, it brought order to the chaos. We basically had a lot of employees on projects not knowing what the next step was or not knowing who they could go to, and everybody would come to us. So at one point, we had like 20 people directly reporting to both Mark and I, and it wasn't really fair to either side because there was too much for Mark and I to handle at that point on how to answer this question for the project or how to answer what this client request meant, because no one knew where they could go. It was just chaos,
Mm-hmm.
and really going through the EOS process completely changed that. And I think it did for you a little bit as well too, Jay. Right?
Yeah, totally. It seems like when you're a certain size company, maybe a handful of people, 5 or something like that, uh, you can kind of manage the chaos by just over communicating and having really great people who work hard. And but after a certain size, then that kind of falls apart, right? There's no way for 100 people to do that same thing just by everybody
Right.
muscling through.
Right.
And so EOS provides some of that structure that helped you guys grow. Because I know now you're a lot bigger than a handful of people. You're many, many handfuls of people. So
Yep.
do you attribute some of that success and some of that growth to implementing EOS at BizStream?
I do. I think a lot of it came down to that. It's the fact that going through some of the people processes that they have in the system, and just understanding. The big thing for us was really taking that sort of flat structure of everybody reports to Mark and Brian to what EOS calls an accountability chart, and creating seats in the organization that were meant for specific responsibilities or accountabilities,
Mm-hmm.
and having the way for us to create project teams came out of that approach. The way for us to understand how we support our organization with things like HR, finance, legal, even. Not that we needed those every single hour of every single day, because we're not like a 150-person company, but there are times you need those things. And it was like, well, wait, who's doing that? Who's taking
Yeah,
this?
yeah,
And
yeah.
having that accountability chart to really represent every single thing that it takes to get a project done in our business, but also to have a company, to have make sure payroll runs on time, make sure that there's a good culture involved, make sure that all the things that like we have a building here at BizStream. Who's going to take care of the parking lot when it crumbles? Like we need the facility manager. Like going through and thinking about all the areas of your business, putting in the right seats, organizing that structure into accountability charts. That was a massive change for us. And actually, that was one of the hardest things we went through because there's the system of EOS does not mandate how you do that, right? They may give you a couple examples. And we started out with just our leadership team first in that example. Well, who are the 6 people on BizStream's leadership team? What are they responsible for? And then we took that concept and we rolled it out to the whole rest of the organization. And now everybody knows what they're accountable for, and everybody actually has a number that they're measured by. So yeah, that was a huge thing for us to make it so that I wasn't working 80 hours a week anymore.
So a lot of people, when they kind of start hearing about the details of EOS, they say, well, that doesn't sound like rocket science, right? I think that's a pretty common reaction. That's a little bit how I felt even when I started reading about it. In fact, I think the guy who started EOS even talks about in his book Traction about how he's basically stolen all the best ideas from all the most popular business books and put them together into a system, right? So there's a lot of things that aren't like new ideas. So if you were talking to someone who was thinking about EOS, but then they had this reaction of like, well, none of this is rocket science. I'll just do an org chart. I'll set up a meeting schedule. How would you talk to them about whether EOS is any different than just kind of implementing those common sense things themselves?
Well, it's funny you bring that up because that's exactly me. You just described me at the beginning of this process. Mark brought it to me and had seen another organization here in West Michigan go through it because he's on their board. And he was telling me the ideas at just a quick passing, level, not like the full details. And I'm like, well, that's not rocket science. I think I literally said that to myself about this process. And I was somewhat skeptical, as I normally am about brand new things. But what I would say to someone, and actually maybe Mark might have said this to me, or I came to the conclusion of myself, is like, yeah, it's not rocket science. However, it's discipline that we lack. And when you have the discipline to follow the processes, because they're so simple, it just becomes easy. So there is not a giant learning curve. It's not like you have to spend years and years and years figuring this out. Now, actually, it can take a while. We actually, I want to say it took us like 18 to 20 months in total to do the whole thing. But it's just, yes, it's not rocket science. But if you follow the steps, the details, they're just life-changing. In following them is something I would really recommend. I would not try to make your own process on top of it or change. Like eventually it becomes your own process. Like now we just say it's the BizStream way. But to learn it and to make sure everyone is following the same thing, it's like you said before, it's like we're all rowing in the same direction. Every meeting is run the same way. Everyone knows they need to be on time. Everybody knows expectations. It just brings clarity to the organization, transparency, and people appreciate just things function the same no matter what they're going into or maybe what the project they're creating. We have processes defined, and it's a better way to work, honestly.
Nice. So you mentioned earlier that there's maybe 5 or 6 different aspects that EOS asks you to implement, right? There's things like setting your company's vision or company values. There's a weekly leadership meeting. There's a quarterly and annual strategy cadence. There's weekly tasks or to-dos that you have. And there's longer term strategic things. That I think the thing that the most people have heard of from EOS, which is those are called rocks in EOS, right? And that's what I run into people having heard about the most. So there's a bunch of components of that EOS system. Of those different components, which do you think was the hardest lift for you guys to implement at BizStream?
It's a great question. Like, yeah, you're right. The people analyzer, the VTO, all those things. It's funny. I even explained already. I go back to the accountability chart. That was the hardest thing for BizStream to do. That's something that was very challenging for us because we thought of at least 3 different ways to do things, and we are not great at saying, "Hey, there's a seat first that has responsibilities instead of thinking about the person that naturally you might align to that seat right away. And we were thinking
Right.
about people too much. And, people can change in an organization. So it really does matter to have, here's the responsibility of that seat. Here's how it reports up in the structure. Um, and to make that the whole chart and to make it a system that can just run itself,
Yeah.
not, is it just Brian running over here? So the accountability chart was very difficult for us. It took us a long time because we also had some people issues.
Mm.
And I think for many years we skirted around those people issues. And that's the other part of EOS is it gives you that people analyzer tool to basically, do they want to be here and are they getting it? And you
Yeah.
kind of have to have that hard conversation. It gives you that framework to do that. But once you put the right seats in place and you get the right people, it's really good for your organization. It becomes very healthy. Um, and then I think lastly, which I will say, even though uh, we have graduated our EOS journey technically, um, documenting all the core processes at the organization is
Yeah.
still not done. Um, we have many of them, but not all. So I think that's another challenge that we have is documenting the core processes. We have
Yeah.
many of them on the software side, as we've talked about. But some of the other things, we're not quite there, but we're getting.
That's so funny. I mean, you wouldn't be a software company if you didn't struggle with documentation,
It's
right?
totally true. Totally true.
So just for the uninitiated, you were talking about seats, the accountability chart and seats. And so those seats in EOS are kind of like roles or positions, if you will, in the company. And it really forces your hand pretty early on. I mean, it's almost step one of the process. It's kind of step two, I guess, because it's after you kind of figure out who you are and what your like mission for existing is, right?
Yep.
But step two of that process is figuring out what the roles that you need to exist in your company to actually implement that mission and vision. And it's really hard not to think about that in the way of who do we have right now, and just like as we say in this software industry, like jumping straight to the solution, right?
Right. Yeah.
Um, so when you implemented EOS, silly question here, but EOS is a bit opinionated about the terminology. In fact, when you actually use EOS documents to do your processes, they'll have little trademarks after all of their special little words and acronyms and stuff. So it's almost like when you start telling someone about EOS, you almost can see the look come over their face, like you're trying to convince them that the cult that you're in is really cool, right? Did you guys struggle at all, or did you personally struggle at all with any of the naming? And how did you overcome that if you did?
So I don't think we struggled too much with the naming. It definitely took a little bit to get what the acronyms were. Like, hey, is it the people thing sometimes was mentioned, or is,
Right.
what does VTO stand for? Yeah. So, but it wasn't too bad because, frankly, we made a decision to bring in an implementator and a coach basically to
Yeah.
help us through the process. And you have that choice. You can self-implement, as they call it, by reading the books, getting the worksheets, and that's all available. Or you can kind of bring in someone who's certified in the process. Well, certified, I don't know. Let's just say certified in the process, who's gone through it with other companies and organizations. And that coach really kept us in line with, nope, don't do that. Don't call it that. Don't try to come up with your own names. And I definitely see the value in uh, the coach and not changing names. But to stay on your question about the names, yeah, we had our other names for these things over the years. We had company goals, which you could equate to rocks in a way. We had to-do items or tasks. So some things were like, well, we could just call it this because we've always called it this. And we said, no, we need to follow the process. Everyone has to call it the same thing. Let's not call it two different things. So the
Right.
naming actually is important, and I really recommend don't try to change the names of things because it's just going to be more confusing.
Sort of like in software when someone starts trying to re-architect how the framework they're working on actually works, usually that ends up being a very painful experience, right? Just
Yep.
go with the flow a little bit.
Yep. Yep. Try not to refactor everything, guys.
That's right. We are engineers, so we always come in and say like, "Oh, I could have done this better," right? I'll
Yep.
re-architect this.
Mm.
Um, So you mentioned in that answer, you mentioned about using an implementer, which is sort of like a EOS consultant, if you will. Obviously, hiring those folks isn't free. You and I both used one of those implementers. If you were talking to somebody who was thinking about EOS and they were thinking about doing it themselves or thinking about using an implementer, how would you advise them based on your experience using an implementer?
Yeah, the short answer to that question is I would fully advise it. I totally would. It helped us basically be more efficient, stay on track better, and that person brings their experience with other organizations, not even tech companies, although sometimes tech companies, that said, hey, they did it this way, you could consider this. And it sometimes is really nice to hear that real world experience of someone who's went through this process already. But it's funny, we had that decision, right? Should we self implement? Should we bring in a coach? And I talked to another agency in Ohio that does exactly what we do at BizStream. They're the same company almost. I'm good friends with the president. I've known for a long time. They self implemented. And I wanted to hear what his experience was before we decided to bring in the coach. Because you're right, it does cost, substantial amount depending on the size of your company. And I wanted to be sure that that investment was worth it. And
Mm-hmm.
hearing him say that they loved the ideas, but they never found the time to get to implement, or they had a question here and they didn't know where to go, and they spent a lot of time researching on Google, what is this thing? What do we do next? And that I think is the value of having the coach.
Mm-hmm.
You just go faster and you
Yeah.
make an impact on your organization quicker. So that's really why I recommend doing it.
So there's a sense in which maybe even though the implementer costs money that you wouldn't pay if you were doing it yourself, that maybe it actually saves you money because of the time that it gets you,
I think so.
the compression of the process,
Yep.
not doing it wrong for a while and then like taking a long time to implement it over many years because you're just not experienced doing it, right?
Yep. Yep. And I don't know if we want to mention it, or can we mention his name? Do you want to do that?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Yeah. So Scott Patchen is both of our EOS coaches, and Scott also brings some fantastic value to all of our conversations about going off on tangents and reeling us back in. Because as you said before, we're engineers. We like to solve things. We would always jump to solving things way too fast in our quarterlies. And he was the one who actually was like, no, everyone stop and go back to what is the issue. We're not on the solve yet for the IDS. So that's another thing that he did a great job at. And yeah, I'm really happy. In fact, we still bring him in from time to time, even though we've kind of graduated.
Yeah. Yeah. Same. Uh, his experience was invaluable to us, and so just to kind of mention his website, if people are interested in checking him out, looking at implementers, Brian and I probably both recommend him strongly. And it's Scott SCOTT Patchin. That's PATCHIN.com.
Mhm.
And I'm sure he'd be happy to hear from you and talk to you about how the process works. Okay, so you implemented EOS. You guys graduated how long ago now?
Good question. I think we graduated probably 3 years ago now.
Okay, so you've been doing it a while. How long did it take you in total to get from the point where, obviously, there's the lifelong learner thing, right? Like you've never
Yep.
perfected it. You're always getting better, even over these last few years. But how long did
Right.
it take to get from the point where you called Scott to the point where he said you had graduated?
Yeah, I want to say it was right around 18 months.
Yeah.
So in total, it really does take at least a year. Sometimes I think he would mention to us that typical companies might take 2 years to do the whole thing.
Yeah.
But I think our technical nature and some of the systems that we already had in place, like we talk about a scorecard, we already had some systems that we could bring together. So I think that helped us go a little quicker than the average 2 years. But like you said, we're never done. There's still more that we could do.
Right. Yeah. Um, Great. Well, so one of the questions I like to finish up with my guests is to ask what other topics, besides EOS in this case, do you think we should talk about on this podcast? And if there's anybody that you think might be associated with those topics around, software success that you would like to see us talk about in the future.
Wow, it's a great question. I'm not sure I'm prepared for the person's name, but as far as the topic goes, I know something that a lot of agencies have asked me about recently is the way we work with clients in a security focused world,
Mm-hmm.
right? With all of the new data privacy rules, the data protection rules out there, how as an agency or a software development company do you work with your clients when there's sensitive data involved? Do you have access to that in your development cycles? Do you not? What techniques and strategies do you have about remote work that make sure that data is secure and private? I would love to hear more about that because it's a challenge that we're
Mm-hmm.
facing all the time at BizStream with a lot of our clients. Um, as far as a person, boy, I don't know.
That's fine if I'm on my own to find the person for that topic. But yeah, that is
Yeah,
a really valuable topic because nothing would make a software project or company more unsuccessful than getting sued for having a major
right,
data breach and
right.
going out of business or
Yeah.
something.
And isn't
So
it crazy how
that's
you hear about it more and more each week? It feels like, oh, this company had a breach or this one had a cyber attack. Like
right.
it's such a big deal about delivering secure software. That I think is a great topic.
Yeah, even credit cards where you would think that they would have kind of solved that by now. Like how long do you have a credit card before the numbers get stolen and go out on the black web? It feels like maybe a couple of years at the longest for me if I'm actually using the card at all. So
Yeah.
it's definitely an issue that's affecting a lot of companies out there. Well, Brian, thanks so much for your time and for talking a little bit about EOS and how that's helped you at BizStream and us too at Trailhead be more successful with our software projects. Appreciate your time for coming on the podcast.
Hey, I had a great time, Jay. Thanks for having me. I'm happy to come back anytime you want.
All right, sounds good. Thank you, Brian.
Thanks.
Well, we've reached the end of this episode of the Blue Blazes podcast. If you're interested in hearing more conversations like this one with industry leaders focused on how to make software projects more predictably successful, make sure you subscribe. Trailhead can be found online at trailheadtechnology.com, on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. Until next time, thanks for listening.